Hello and welcome to Module 8 of the Advanced Design Training, focusing on the RDD, the Regression Discontinuity Study Review Guide, or SRG. The RDD SRG helps guide reviewers, WWC reviewers, through reviews of regression discontinuity designs. Before we get started, I just want to say that this example, or this video, is going to use a study as an example of an SRG, a study review. And this study is what were the reach and impact of the Oregon Promise Financial Aid Program in its first 2 years. This is a study by the Regional Education Laboratory Northwest. We believe it is a high quality study, good example of regression discontinuity design, and about as straightforward of a review as any regression discontinuity design is ever going to be. It's a very complicated design, and reviewing can take time. Before we begin, I encourage you to look through this study. Now, this study doesn't just have a regression discontinuity design in it. It actually asks a bunch of questions. I think 7 or 8 research questions. And so the RDD study is just this question 2A. And so you want to go ahead and read through the study. You want to, read the introduction, understand what the Oregon Promise program was. It's a last dollar financial aid program for Oregon high school or GRE, recent Oregon high school graduates, or people who got their GED, I should say, that helps pay for 2-year college. So read through the main study, read about read about the sample, and read about how they approach 2A. Now, most of what you need the information you need to review the study is not actually going to be in the body of the main study. It's going to be in the appendices. RDDs are very complicated studies. They require a lot of sensitivity analysis and plot checking to sort of make sure that the model-based approach is functioning properly. And so it's going to be not uncommon in the process of reviewing RDD studies. You'll need to refer to appendices. As with the main study, not every element of this appendix is important for your purposes. So you will want to look through it. You want to understand what the promise programs are about. You want to sort of understand the general sample. You want to look through the methods in general, because there's a lot about the data sources and how they derive the samples for the various research questions. But again, we're really interested in research question 2A. And so B6 through about B16 is where the fuzzy RDD, the last of the fuzzy RDD materials are located. And then there's also going to be information in Appendix C, where we can see some of the, or we'll have to look for the fuzzy RDD results. So if you haven't yet, go ahead and read through the study, the appendix, try and get a sense of what you think the study rating should be, and then also go ahead and take a look at the example SRG that's available on the training page, because we'll be providing you with this example, you want to sort of come to this prepared to listen to what I'm talking about, already be kind of familiar with the example SRG. So again, if you haven't done this yet, go ahead and pause the video, take a look at the materials provided, and then come back and listen to the rest of this. Okay, Now that we're all on the same page with regards to how to prepare for this, to watch the rest of this video, let's dive right into it. So in the main tab of the first row, you will often find most of this information filled out. So this first entry on row 1 in column A, this is going to be either the study's citation, or it's going to be the ERIC ID. If the ERIC ID is available, always use the ERIC ID. The way you can find it is by going to eric.ed.gov, looking for the study. This is the ERIC ID associated with the REL report. And you can see I've selected it over here, the ERIC number, and put it into that top left column. This may already be populated for you by your review team leadership. Make sure that it's accurate. Next is going to be a study, an OSRG study number. This study is actually already in the OSRG, so I put the correct study number here. Under the study review guide, or the reviewer ID, I just put SRG trainer, and then I put a date for the review. The next 3 lines are regarding the study review protocol, topic area protocol, and the intervention name. Now, as of the time of this video, the most up-to-date version of the study review protocol is version 5.0. It's the study review protocol governs all study reviews done by the Works Clearinghouse. And it is possible that at some future time, the WWC will release a new version of the study review protocol. In that case, you want to make sure that you're using the correct version of the review protocol for your study review. So just double check this number here, make sure it's right. Reviews that take place under a topic area, so reviews that are taking place under some sort of synthesis product, will also have a topic area protocol. In the event that a topic area protocol is being used, provide the name and version number in column B. Now, this review is not taking place under any topic area protocol, so I'm going to leave that blank. The intervention name, there are conventions around the intervention name. If you have access to this, to the OSRG, there's an appendix in the OSRG user guide that describes this in some detail. The Oregon Promise intervention is already in the OSRG, and it uses this name, so I've already entered it here. If an intervention is already in the OSRG and there are already study reviews, you want to use the intervention name that's already in the OSRG. Otherwise, you need to consult the appendix to get the correct way to refer to the intervention. And you also see that I started documenting where I get information. So this last column D is where you're going to enter page numbers that correspond to the information that you've entered in the study. Sometimes your conclusion doesn't correspond to any particular page, but when it does correspond to a page, you always want to document where you're getting your information, so that anybody who comes behind you and reads your review, trying to understand the decisions you made, or maybe the reconciler is reconciling your review against another reviewer's review of the same study, and if there's any issues, they can sort of figure out, okay, why did they come to these conclusions? The next section is the screening criteria. These are the overall screening criteria that all studies of any kind of design go through. From here forward, in general, if you're answering a question that has a simple, straightforward answer, you don't necessarily need to document supporting information, concerns, or questions in column C. If there's any ambiguity about it, or you're making some sort of assumption, or you have a question, or you're sort of not sure that somebody who came behind you and looked at this would understand why you made the choices that you did, you should go ahead and provide an explanation here. But if your explanation would just be a restating of the prompt that's in column A, it's not really necessary to provide detail here. So first question is, did the study examine the effect of an intervention? Yep, the intervention was the Oregon Promise Program, which is a the last mile financial aid program. Is the report publicly available? It is, and REL's reports are actually in the public domain. I've included some links here to the report and to the appendix, just so that there's some documentation there about its public availability. ERIC entries are always the preferred source for WWC reviews. We only go to other search engines or other sources if a study's not on ERIC. It's a complete research report. It was published in 2021, which is well within the specified in the protocol. Since there's no topic area protocol, we're going to default to the study review protocol, which defaults to the last 20 years, as is described in the handbook. The research report is in English. It studies students. It is located in Oregon, which is in the United States. And this is a policy, a state policy, as described in the handbook. And finally, there is at least one outcome in the review protocol domain. There are 3 outcomes that are eligible for review. There's whether or not students were enrolled within 6 months of high school graduation, enrolled in college, which is in the college enrollment domain, enrolled in college within 2 years of high school graduation in the college enrollment domain, and persisted during the first year of college in the progressing in college domain. When you get to the outcomes row, it's always good to describe the eligible outcomes and the domains that they came from. And as you can see, I've continued to document anything that comes from the study, or there's like a particular part of the study that I'm drawing this information from, I've documented here along the right side. There's an additional outcome that we'll talk about near the end of this video. So, based on your responses to these screening questions, this question about whether or not the study meets WWC and review protocol screening criteria will auto-populate. If you answer all yeses, it'll be a yes. If any of these questions are no, well, it's not eligible, so this will fill with a no. You'll select the screening disposition code. If the study is eligible for review, you don't need to explain your disposition code. But if data scope is our protocol or doesn't meet the screening criteria, you go ahead and select that and describe why it didn't meet requirements. Next, if you're reviewing a study for quick reviews, single study reviews or grant reviews or an IES funded study, you need to select appropriate tags. There are a handful of tags. I have selected college readiness and completion. You can select as many tags as are appropriate. There are rows for 3 tags. It's possible that you may need more than 3 tags. If so, in the 3rd study tag row, just list additional tags in column C. But most studies will be covered in 1 to 3 tags. And then finally, there's a question about whether or not this is a multi-site study. So this study didn't take place in more than 1 state, but it did cover several districts and schools in the Portland metro area. So it qualifies as a multi-site study, so I've selected yes. And note that you want to fill out these 3 questions, whether or not it's eligible for review. If this study didn't meet the general eligibility requirements, you wouldn't need to go on to fill out the RDD eligibility requirements, but this study does. So we're gonna move on to the RDD screening criteria. So Is the intervention assignment based on an ordinal numerical forcing variable? The answer is yes, it's based on the student GPA. Does forcing variable have at least 4 unique values above and 4 unique values below the cutoff value? So it's a GPA of 2.5 as the cutoff, and there are not an infinite number of values above and below 2.5, but there are well over 4 unique values above and below the cutoff value. And is the forcing variable that was used to calculate impacts the same as the forcing variable that was used to assign units to groups? This is a really important question because a lot of times researchers will try and reconstruct forcing variables. They might sort of have a description of how a forcing variable was formed and then use the data they have access to reconstruct it. But unless they have evidence that that is an exact copy, that it is really the true forcing variable, that doesn't meet the eligibility requirements. However, in this study, they used the data that was provided to them by the Oregon Higher Education, by the state of Oregon. That was the data that was used in these students' applications for. I'm sorry, that's not correct. The GPAs came from data provided by the K-12, the Oregon Department of Education for K-12, and the unweighted, the high school grade point averages provided by the school districts that were the primary sample in this study. And so those GPAs were what we used to assign, to determine eligibility for the program. So, like above, this row 28 will auto-populate based on the questions, the yes or no answers in these drop-downs. If you've selected no anywhere, it will say no. If you select yes for all 3 of them, it'll say yes. And again, you want to select the study eligibility. You always want to describe why a study is not eligible. In this case, I have described the study review focus in this row because, as I described earlier, this study is complicated, it has a bunch of designs in it, and so I want to specify that I'm just looking at the fuzzy RDD design that was used in the sample from the Portland metro area who graduated high school in the 2015 to 2016 school year. For studies like this one that are that meet all the eligibility requirements, we're going to move on to stage 2 of the SRG. The first thing you want to do is indicate whether assignment to condition took place at the individual level or the cluster level. Student eligibility for this program was based on individual GPAs. It wasn't based on any like high school information. Sometimes there are policies or practices that are developed by states whereby schools or districts become eligible for programs, and so students are then placed into condition based on their cluster assignment and not their individual assignment. In this case, it's individual level assignment RDD. And is the study free of any confounding factors? In particular, we're interested in cases where the cutoff value of the forcing variable is used to assign members of the study sample to services other than the one being studied. So the later years in the program involved the family's expected financial contribution based on their application, their FAFSA application. However, the 2015 to 2016 criteria was just the GPA threshold. And so there are no confounds in the study that we are aware of. Some students may have been, may have Pell Grants or other need-based scholarships or grants, but they were not based on their GPA. They're based on other, income factors. And so the forcing variable of the GPA And the cutoff value is unrelated to any other programs. And so then once we have arrived here, we're going to click on this link to the data tab, and it'll take us over to the data tab. Took a second to get to the right place. And so I filled out one row for each finding. These first two findings are in the college enrollment, and the second one's in the progressing college domain. All three of these are binary, right? You either have enrolled or haven't enrolled. You either have persisted or you haven't persisted. It's not a standardized test, but it does have face validity, and I'll talk about that in a second. Well, no, I'll talk about it now. So you'll see that I haven't filled out any of the reliability information. All the data in this study came from administrative records, and under the 5.0 handbook, administrative records are automatically considered valid and reliable. So I just went ahead and selected yes for face validity, and I made a note in the notes or concerns column about that. These outcomes are not over-aligned with the intervention. All the data was collected. The outcomes are collected using the same measure and collection, as far as we know, right? This administrative data. Therefore, they meet WWC requirements. This is not, neither of these domains have independent measures as a concern. And so I just haven't answered this column. So we've answered all these questions in the affirmative. These studies, these outcomes all meet the WWC requirements. So we can go back and respond to this row here that asks about the whether at least one relevant outcome meets the review requirements. I've described the three outcomes here, but you may not necessarily be part of the detail here. Okay, moving on to the standards. Standard one is the integrity of the forcing variable standard, as you may recall from the training that you've been watching. The first question is about the institutional check. So here we're looking to see if there's any possibility of if manipulation of the forcing variable was likely. Now, in other years of the programs, it's possible that members of school districts or students may have had incentive to manipulate their GPAs in order to qualify for the Oregon Promise program. However, in 2015 and 2016, there's indication that both the students and employees of the high schools they were attending didn't really understand the cutoff and that it was a hard 2.5 GPA cutoff. They encouraged everyone who was anywhere close to the 2.5 GPA to enroll or to apply for the program. And so while future years may have had some manipulation, it's unlikely that manipulation occurred, that people had the incentive and the opportunity, right? If you have only the incentive or only the opportunity, but you don't have both, you don't fail the institutional check. And so overall, we believe that this meets the institutional requirement. The statistical check, right? They have to use a statistical check to look for lumping around or continuity in the density of the forcing variable around the cutoff. These authors use the McCrary test, which is probably the most common test. And for all three of the bandwidths they used in the study, they were non-significant at the 5% significance level. And as I've gone down, right, remember, I keep documenting all of where I'm getting all this information in the pages column. Finally, is there a graphical check? Is the integrity of the forcing variable demonstrated using graphical analysis? There's a histogram, figure B2, that demonstrates the density of the forcing variable. And there's really no lumping at the cutoff that would suggest discontinuity. So it meets this requirement. So based on your responses to these three columns and in all of the following ones, all the following standards, this will automatically populate. So it'll either say completely satisfies, partially satisfies, tells you to complete standard 1 questions, or it'll say does not satisfy if it doesn't satisfy one of the standards. If at any point an RDD study doesn't satisfy a standard, your review ends, and you can skip down to the bottom where you describe the final rating of the study. Okay, so next is the sample attrition and baseline equivalent standard. For every study that for every study you have to think about, or at least the review team has to consider what the appropriate attrition boundary is. And so you see most of these, the outcomes, enrolling in college, persisting in college, they are likely to be affected by the intervention. And so attrition might be endogenous to the intervention, right? In other words, attrition could be caused by being in either the comparison or the intervention group, probably the comparison group, right? If you receive financial aid, you're more likely to persist in college or to enroll in college than you are if you don't receive financial aid. So here we've selected the cautious boundary. Now, here's where things get tricky. The study authors don't actually provide quite enough information in the study to calculate attrition. However, we actually sent an author query and received permission to share it with you. We asked them to provide differential attrition around the plus or minus 2.24 bandwidth around the 2.5 GPI cutoff. And they provided us with the assigned and analytic sample sizes for this bandwidth. So this is where the other thing to know is that the authors only used an appropriate bandwidth or a justified bandwidth for a couple of the outcomes. And so we actually only calculated attrition for high school enrollment within 6 months of high school exit. College enrollment within 6 months of high school exit. So I'm going to go over to the data tab. Once again, it didn't jump for me, but it should go to the right. It's highlighted the right thing here. So for calculating attrition, you have 3 options. You have predicted proportions of the cutoff, predicted percentages of the cutoff, or unadjusted rates. We go back into the main tab. We can, for this criterion A, we can calculate overall differential attrition inside the bandwidth without adjusting for the forcing variable. So one of the tricky things in assessing attrition in general in RDDs is you need the whole universe of eligible students. So you can't just use if the authors had only used the promise application data and not used the unweighted, the data they got from the school districts, this study you wouldn't even be able to calculate attrition here. Because you wouldn't have the whole universe of students from the Portland metro area. However, it's the focusing on students from the Portland metro area constitutes an exogenous exclusion. Students wouldn't be in the metro area, wouldn't go to the metro area schools because of this program. And so membership in these Portland metro area schools is not a function of being assigned to the intervention. So we can just look at all students in the Portland metro area who graduated high school in the 2015 to 2016 year who were within the bandwidth for the outcome of enrolling in college within 6 months of high school exit. So this is an individual unit of assignment. You always need to select that. It's used for attrition and effect size calculations. Even if you don't calculate attrition, you're going to have to select this eventually. So our assigned sample is 795 students in the intervention group, 648 students in the comparison group. The analytics sample is 754 students in the intervention group, 629 students in the comparison group, and it automatically calculates overall and differential attrition for you. And it calculates that attrition is low. So for row 44, we select yes, because it's possible to calculate attrition. If it wasn't possible, you would select no and move on to the baseline equivalence standard or criterion. But here, this satisfies criterion A. We have low overall and differential attrition for one of the three outcomes that were eligible for review. It's not possible to calculate attrition for those other two outcomes at all. And unfortunately, it's not possible to determine for the outcomes where it wasn't possible to determine low attrition. It's also not possible to estimate baseline equivalence on enough demographic variables. You need for outcomes like these where you can't have a pretest, where you can't have a pretest for persisting or for enrolling in college. You have to have a pretest on some broad domain of academic ability, and then two demographic characteristics. This study was published just before 5.0 came out, and so under the old 4.1 SRP, they would have been able to establish baseline equivalence. And so that's the only reason why a REL study like this doesn't meet standards, where if the standards get a little tougher, they may not report all the information we need. It's likely, based on some balance tests, that the sample is balanced, but there's just not enough information to determine it here using the model-based approach that is required by the standards. This is NA because if we were reviewing under the optimistic boundary, they don't need to control for these variables and we'd be in great shape. But because the model controls for a ton of demographic variables, it would be more than good enough. But because we use the cautious boundary, we have to establish baseline equivalence for any of the outcomes where we can't establish low attrition. So for the one finding or the one outcome that we can't establish low attrition, it completely satisfies standard 2. Moving on to standard 3. So the first criterion is looking at whether there's graphical evidence that shows no unexplained discontinuities away from the cutoff, like large ones that are larger than 2 times the standard error of the impact estimated with the cutoff. This is one of those. This is a question that's kind of tricky. Sometimes it's hard to tell from the plots. I looked at the bin scatter plots in figure B3 on page B15 of the appendix. There's a lot of variability in these scatter plots. It doesn't look to me like there are large discontinuities, just that there's a lot of variance in the data. And so I made the judgment call that I believe that these met the graphical evidence requirement. I discussed it with other individuals who have some expertise in the standards and in reviewing RDD studies, and they agreed with me. Anytime you have questions about these graphical evidence standards, it's always good to talk to review team leadership. If you've got a content expert, an expert on RDDs in your review team, talk to them. Make a judgment together about this kind of standard. The authors do not provide any statistical evidence at all of other or that there are no discontinuities away from the cutoff. So this is just a no. And as a consequence, the study or these findings partially satisfy this requirement. Functional form bandwidth standard is next. Criterion A focuses on whether they use a local average treatment effect, estimated using a statistical model that controls the forcing variable. Yes, all of the statistical models for all the findings, all the outcomes in the study are controlled for the forcing variable. Criterion B is a tricky one for this study. So it asks whether the study uses a local regression or a related non-parametric approach where impacts are estimated within a justified bandwidth. So they did use an optimal bandwidth. However, they only reported the bandwidths on 0.24, 0.27, and 0.3. These bandwidths correspond to the optimal bandwidth for college enrollment with 6 months of high school exit, a bandwidth of 0.27 that corresponds to college persistence in the first year of college. All the findings in the study focused on the smallest bandwidth of 0.24. And it's quite possible that this is a justifiable decision methodologically, but it does not meet the WWC standards for college enrollment within 2 years of high school exit, because that has an optimal bandwidth of 0.26. Just how it goes. So for but for college enrollment within 6 months of high school exit and persistence in the first year of college, both meet this this criterion. None of them use the best fit regression, so the college enrollment within 2 years can't meet this requirement. So I put no there. If all of them, if all of them had met the local regression requirement, I would have probably selected NA, but because the college enrollment outcome could potentially have met this requirement, I've also selected no here. There's criterion D, robustness. There are 5 types of robustness evidence. Not going to review them all here, but the sign and significance of the justified bandwidth and the 2 unjustified bandwidths are the same for both college enrollment within 6 months of high school exit and college persistence in the first year of college. And you can see this in table C8. So they reported the outcomes for 0.24, 0.27, and 0.3. And 0.24 is justified for college enrollment within 6 months of high school exit, and 0.27 is justified for persistence in the first year of college. The other 2 outcomes, or the other 2 bandwidths, are unjustified bandwidths. And so this meets the robustness check requirement. Criterion E indicates that asks whether there's graphical analysis that displays the relationship between outcome and the forcing variable, including a scatter plot and a fitted curve. That displays with a display that's not obviously inconsistent, right? We're really looking for obvious inconsistencies. And this figure B3 on page B15, the trajectory looks pretty linear to me. And they used a linear model, like just a typical regression where there's a slope, a linear slope away from the cutoff on the forcing variable. Finally, just I added that because I realized I was missing the documentation there. Is it true that the relationship between the forcing variable and the outcome is not constrained to be the same on both sides of the cutoff? And that's true. There's an interaction between, there's an indicator for being on either side of the cutoff that lets the slope be different on either side. All right, finally, the fuzzy regression discontinuity design. standard. Frequently, this requirement will be waived, even when even when compliance isn't perfect in RDD studies. It's often common to do a sharp RDD and intent to treat analysis, but the authors did do a fuzzy RDD, and so we're going to review that fuzzy RDD. So the first few questions, it's typically not, if you answer yes, you don't really need to provide any explanation. The participation indicator is binary for taking at least a portion of the intervention, right? So students were indicated as having participated if they applied, and received the intervention, the Oregon Promise financial aid. The estimation model has exactly one participation indicator. It's true. And then the indicator for being above or below a cutoff is a binary indicator for the groups which the study participants are assigned. Yes, that's also true. And the same covariates included in the analysis that estimates the impact on the participation and the analysis that estimates the impact on the outcome. It's also true. This is all described in B16. Criterion E asks about the exclusion restriction. Really, the exclusion restriction is focused on whether the intervention could have had any impact on the outcome. Assignment to the intervention, I should say, like whether they were assigned to the intervention or comparison group, that could have an impact on the outcome, except through take up of the intervention. And there's sort of no reason to think that that being assigned to the intervention or not assigned to the intervention would affect the college enrollment, other than because they did or did not receive financial aid. The other way that the exclusion restriction can be violated is if participation is defined inconsistently between the intervention comparison groups, but it is simply, did they receive financial aid? For criterion F, it's about the relationship between the forcing variable and the intervention needs to be strong enough based on an F statistic or a T statistic. You should always report the F statistic here in column 70. Now for criterion G and criterion H, this is asking about whether the justified bandwidth was used, or else a best fit functional form. Now, the authors do describe the use of a justified bandwidth. It's a little ambiguous from the description whether the bandwidths were justified for the impact estimate, like the ratio, or separate justified bandwidths for the numerator and the denominator. So it's clear that they use a justified bandwidth that is justified for the numerator, in which case it's definitely going to meet criterion H. Now, if we got up to this point and we had completely satisfied all the standards, we might want to query the authors to find out, hey, did you use, was the bandwidth for the denominator justified or not, right? Because it's possible that they could fully meet or fully satisfy standard 5. But because the highest possible rating at this point for any finding meets WWC standards with reservations, it's sufficient to partially satisfy this standard. So we're not going to add additional questions to our author report. We're just going to say, good enough. We don't need any more information here. We're going to say that it meets criterion H and move on with our review. So this study is free of other analytical issues that could affect the rating. There's nothing in there that I believe affects the rating. If you have anything else, you read the study, you become concerned that there's some other issue in the study that might affect the rating, that it's not captured somewhere else in the SRG, this is the place to record it. The highest possible rating of any main finding in the study, given the current information, is going to auto-populate based on your responses to the standards throughout the study. Next, you want to provide a disposition code. So there's a bunch of codes for if the study doesn't meet standards. And if the study doesn't meet standards, you want to provide a disposition code for every reason that you encounter that it doesn't meet standards. A lot of times there'll only be one reason why it doesn't meet standards, because you'll arrive at a failure to meet one of the criterion and your study review will end. But if there's, maybe you need to do an author query to get additional information, and you find out that it doesn't meet for multiple reasons, well, you want to provide a disposition code for every reason why it didn't meet standards. If it does meet standards, you can just select that the study meets standards with or without reservations, provide an explanation for why it met standards. The next row is for an author query. If you're doing an initial study review, you want to describe any information here that you need to arrive at a final rating for the study. This is information that could change the final rating. If this is the final master review guide, you can summarize the information that was provided or not provided by the authors, which is what I've done here, and how it affects the rating. And then finally, if there are findings that receive multiple ratings, you want to go ahead and describe all of the findings in the study and the different ratings they received. So, right, I've described all 3 findings that were eligible for review, the ratings they got, and the reasons for those ratings. For studies that meet WWC standards, we move on to the stage 3 part of the study, where we're going to fill out some study details, some demographic information, and so on. The first step, though, is actually to follow this link to the data tab, designate findings as main or supplemental, and calculate effect sizes. So I've only selected a main finding for the first outcome. The second and third outcomes are actually not main or supplementary findings, so we can sort of skip this section for those findings. Now, when you get to this section, you want to make sure that you've selected individual or cluster level assignment way back in row O, because a lot of these calculations are going to depend on the choice of assignment that you selected earlier. There are 3 ways to calculate effect sizes from RDDs. Really 2 ways. You can have an impact estimate, either with separate standard deviations from the unrestricted sample, or the impact estimate and the total standard deviation from the unrestricted sample, or the predicted probability at the cutoff. The only difference between the first 2 options depends on how the standard deviation is reported. So if you've got a standard deviation for the intervention group and a standard deviation from the comparison group, you want to do the separate standard deviations. If the authors only report the total standard deviation, you can also use that. We also want to get a standard deviation from the unrestricted sample, if at all possible. So that's the sample that's not bound by, or is not within the bandwidth, because that standard deviation is likely to be attenuated by the locality of the sample. And so we want to make sure that we get the full sample standard deviation of the outcome. So if you select one of the first 2 options, this impact separate standard deviations or impact and total standard deviation, you're going to need a few things. You're going to need the impact estimate for the beta, which is going to go in this column. You're going to need either the full sample standard deviation, like I said, or the standard deviations that are separate by group. So the separate by group is here, and then the full sample standard deviation can be entered over here if that's what you have instead. You're also going to need the unstandardized impact standard error, the standard error of the beta. So this is usually reported. If they don't report the standard error, but they do report the t, you can just enter the beta divided by the t to get the standard error here. And for individual assignment studies, that's sufficient. If you have, you'll also need to enter the analytic sample sizes. So the N in the intervention group and the N in the comparison group as they were analyzed. If this is a cluster assignment study, you're going to need a few more things. You're going to need the number of clusters in the intervention group and the number of clusters in the comparison group. And you will also need to select the ICC. It's 0.2 for achievement outcomes or 0.1 for all others. If the authors report an ICC, you can also delete this data validation and enter a value manually. It's pretty infrequent. Most times we have to impute an ICC value. If you're doing predicted probabilities at the cutoff, you'll need a few things. You'll need the intervention effect size. You'll need to find the observed probability of the outcome for the comparison group. You'll need the sample size in the intervention group and the comparison group. And then again, if it's a cluster study, you'll also need the cluster sizes and the number of clusters in each group and select the appropriate ICC. So this comparison group value comes from one of the tables in the appendices. I will find it and I will show you. Oh, there's an error. I'm going to fix it right in front of you guys. It's great. So the comparison group has a 0.4 for their observed probability of being enrolled in college within 6 months. That's 0.4. And then you can see here that I've entered 0.4 plus the impact estimate, which comes from C8, table C8. So in the point plus or minus 0.24, it is 0.225. Make sure I did that right as well. Or no, sorry, student effort award, 0.303. That is the impact estimate. There's a small error there. I'm going to fix that too. Okay. So once you've got, for predicted probabilities, you've got a predicted probability for the intervention group, the intervention N, the comparison group probability, and the comparison group N. It'll automatically calculate the Cox's index, which is comparable to the Hedges G. If you're a little confused about how I arrived at these values, Appendix E talks about covariate adjusted analysis for dichotomous outcomes on page 180, and talks about how to enter the values for adjusted probabilities. And this is a linear probability model, so you can read a little more about linear probability models if you're interested. So if we go over, we can see that it's automatically calculated the impact N, calculated our degrees of freedom. There's no pooled standard error for the Cox index, calculates a G, and then the standard error is calculated automatically. The study reported p-value, let's see. It did not report a p-value. So, let's go back to the main tab. Okay, I paused the video briefly to go double check the study reported p-values, and as I thought, the authors did not report p-values. They only reported if an effect estimate was statistically significant at the 0.05, 0.01, and was it also the 0.011? Yeah, 0.05, 0.01, and 0.001 level. So they didn't report, they did not report specific p-values for the non-significant estimates. While I was there, I did notice that I made a small error. The persisted first year in college, this robustness check actually doesn't meet the standard. I will go back to it and show you. I've already changed it on the SRG. Standard, the functional form of bandwidth standard, standard 4, criterion D. The robustness check, one of the robustness checks that's allowed is when if the sign and significance of the justified bandwidth and two unjustified bandwidths are the same for a finding that meets this requirement. So can see here that for persistent first year in college, the justified bandwidth is positive but non-significant, and these are both significant. Since this one is non-significant, these could have any sign as long as they were non-significant, but they're statistically significant, and so this doesn't meet that robustness requirement. Now, it doesn't matter, it doesn't change the findings rating because, as you may recall, we don't have the attrition information for persistence, and so that finding doesn't meet standards anyway. But we'll go ahead and mention the criterion B issue in the persistence. All right. Once you've completed recording information about calculating effect sizes and any author-reported effect sizes on the data tab, you move on to filling the remainder of the main tab. So first question is whether or not authors reported presented effect sizes, and if so, how are they computed? Well, the authors didn't present effect sizes, they just presented the model estimates. And our estimates presented for supplemental findings that required a review. In the context of the RDDs, there were no supplemental findings. There were just the one sample of interest estimated under 3 different bandwidths. So the next section is the contextual variable section. This set of rows is going to be reported in the OSRG eventually. And that means you need to be careful when you're entering this data, because we want to make sure that when somebody comes behind you and enters this information into the OSRG, they're getting all the answers correct. They're able to maintain the integrity of the data that you've entered into this Excel SRG. So go slowly, try not to make mistakes here. When you're entering information for this, you want to enter information for the primary analytic sample. The primary analytic sample in this case had 1,383 students, and for grades, I've selected multiple grades. So as you go through this section, you'll enter a number for the number of students. There'll be some drop-down boxes where you can select a single value. So if there was just one grade, you could just select that one grade. But there's not. This reports on data both from their senior year and from when they were in this 2-year or some other college. So I've selected multiple grades, and I have written all of the grades in column C. You want to make sure you record all of them. Now, for the demographic data on stuff like race, Hispanic or Latino ethnicity, the authors didn't report demographic data for the sample, the whole sample, and they only reported it for the assigned sample within the bandwidth. So there were a handful of students who were missing some information on the covariates, and they were excluded from the final analysis. So this is actually a slightly larger sample of 1,443 students, and they reported them by the intervention comparison group. And so when demographic characteristics are reported by the intervention comparison group separately, you're going to want to go ahead and report and calculate weighted averages, which I've done using Excel here. I just multiplied the proportion of students that were identified as Asian in the intervention group by the intervention group N, and the proportion of students that reported that they identified as Asian times the comparison group N, and then divided by the whole total N. This is 795 plus 648 right here, and you can see this on page. I think it is noted in the SRG B11. B11. So you can see here, right? 0.06, 0.04. I've multiplied the sample, like the treatment mean, the intervention mean by the 795 students, multiplied the comparison group mean by the 648 students, added those multiplied values together and divided by the total N to get this weighted average. And I've done that for every single, don't want to do that. I've done that for every single value in this cell. And then for the remainder, right? So race was not reported for everyone. The authors of this study treated Latinx as a racial category as opposed to ethnicity, like we do in the WWC reviews. And so a small portion of the students don't have any reported race in the way that the WWC reports it. And so what I've done here is I've just subtracted the total of these cells from 1. So percentages in Excel are represented as proportions. So 100% is 1. So I've subtracted everything else from 100% to get this 32.14%. So this is a good example where if the authors report any values for demographic category, race, ethnicity, gender, free or reduced price lunch, Pell Grant, any of those things, you want to make sure and report as much as possible. And then you want to go ahead and report any remainder in the other or unknown race, because when this is reported in the OSRG, this has to sum up to 100%. This box at the bottom does a few things. First of all, it's blank if you haven't selected anything. So here in row 87, right, it's asked, does the study report any demographic data on race? You're only going to select no if the study provided no information at all. If you select no here, this box fills with not reported, and you can just skip this category. But if you select yes, this box tells you whether the rows in the category sum to 100%. It says yes here, we're golden. If this was just 32%, then this becomes no, we're not quite there. So I'm gonna change that. It says yes, we can move on. Right, this is all similar, right? I've selected yes here for Latinx, I've calculated the weighted average, and then subtracted the remainder from 100%. Selected yes for gender. Didn't have to do a weighted average here because both groups had the exact same gender composition. Calculated the weighted average of English language learners, subtracted the remainder from 100%, Calculated a weighted average for IEP special education. This one, this demographic category, I've actually calculated the weighted average of ever having received special education services. The authors didn't report on current special education, like high school students who had received special education services that year, just whether they'd ever received it. And so I've just made a note here so that when it's entered in the OSRG, somebody can enter it as part of the review notes, and it'll be recorded that we've sort of used something that's not exactly what the category asks for, but it's pretty much close enough. No information on 504 plans was reported. No information about disability was reported. You can see where we've got not reported here, not reported here. Sort of like above with the special education, the authors only reported whether or not students had ever been eligible for the National School Lunch Program, or the free, also known as free reduced price lunch. And so that is the demographic characteristic that I've reported here, calculated the weighted average and subtracted it from 100% to get the no free reduced price lunch. No information about Pell Grants. Well, there was some information about Pell Grants. They didn't report Pell Grants in this format. There's some information about Pell Grants in the primary study, but it's not, it's information about students who received the Oregon Promise Award, and it's not for the assigned or analytic samples. So there's not really a good way to get this information from the study. So I put no here because I can't really say how many students were eligible. Here, I actually want to put general education classrooms. This is tricky because these are typical classrooms in college. So we're going to call it a general education classroom here. For the type of school, I have again selected multiple school types because there were K-12 public schools and 2-year colleges involved in this site, right? They had data from both time periods in the students' life. So that's what I've reported here. Urbanicity, the authors described it as an urban area, and these categories have a very specific definition. If you have access to the OSRG, you can look at the user guide and read a little more about it, but typically you just want to match whatever the authors indicate. If the authors are not specific enough, you might have to do a little research about the area, or if they tell you like approximately where it takes place, but they don't sort of specify urbanicity, you might have to do a little bit of research, but usually the authors will say if it's a rural, suburban, urban, or like a town context. For locations, you want to select all relevant locations. So, there's not more than one location reported. There's just Oregon reported. So I've just selected Oregon. Don't have to do anything else. Delivery method can be individual, small group, whole class, school. Multiple delivery methods. This was delivered to each individual, not in any other context, right? Everybody was eligible and received the award individually. It's policy. It's something that is produced by the state. Practices are a group of, like a set of related activities or practices. That this is not a practice, it's a policy. It's something that's created by the state. It's not a product, right? It's not named. And programs are combinations of practices, products, and policies. This is just a policy. I put not reported for intervention scope because it's not really any of these things. And the intervention target was student. So these following 5 fields are pretty important. They're going to inform study entries on the WWC website. You want to write in complete, concise sentences. You want to be straightforward, easy to read, because these are fields that will feed into the the review of individual studies page that is associated with the study. You can get, you know, if you need a little bit of help, making sure this is correct and contains all the information, obviously talk to your review team leadership. And if this text ends up, or if the study is in an intervention report, the language between the intervention report and the SRG will need to match, and so there'll be a little bit of work to sort of align that language eventually. But you just want to give sort of enough information that people know approximately what's going on. If somebody read all this information, they'd have a general idea of the setting, who the sample was, what the intervention was, and whatever the comparison condition was. Finally, there's a few other pieces below that. These are not going to end up on the website, but they are useful information for the reconciler, for other reviewers, other members of the review team that might look at your SRG and want to know what's going on. The only thing that I'll go into any detail about was there was one outcome that I deemed ineligible for review, and that was the outcome variable regarding whether students were either still enrolled or had completed college in the 2019-2020 school year. There's college completion and there's progressing in college. There's not, doesn't seem to be a domain that this fits into, and so I deemed it as ineligible. If you are not sure, you can always talk to review team leadership. They may want to review a domain or review an outcome and include it in the sort of closest possible domain. So if you're not sure, have a conversation with your leadership. There is only one tab left. There's the summary tab. The summary tab is a sort of concise summary of the information from the study. This domain tab is the only one you have to select. So this will automatically populate with all the domains that are in the data tab. And if you select a domain, it will provide you with a number of findings and report some statistics or some summaries about the values in the data tab based on the main findings. If there's a domain where there are no main findings, it'll just say that there are 0 and report nothing else. And it also gives a little information on the right side about the review. So that concludes the module on the Regression Discontinuity Design SRG. The remaining module focuses on complier average causal effects in group designs and is the final module in the Advanced Group Design Training Series. All the information we've talked about here and the materials we've discussed can be found on the training website, on the WWC website at whatworks.ed.gov.